So the first shift I had with the awakening back in 97 happened at night when I was meditating, and it was just unbound consciousness. And it was a huge, huge shift for me because I had suffered so much. And it was wonderful. It was beautiful. Everything was consciousness, And I remember knowing very clearly, this is what everyone wants. And I thought that was odd that I even thought that, because I thought, I don't know, why would I know what people want? I wasn't like in spiritual groups or anything. I just figured it out by reading 3 Pillars of Zen. It was beautiful, and it was so expansive and wonderful. And then I went to sleep, and I woke up the next morning and I sat to meditate, and I was there immediately. But then it opened to a whole other thing. Like the whole boundary of like physicality disappeared. And so it was that was more like, okay, yeah, things aren't made out of human consciousness is a blip on the radar. There's this whole other thing happening.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Angelo Dilullo. Angelo is an anaesthesiologist and teacher of non-duality who had a life-altering spiritual awakening at the age of 24. He's the author of the book Awake, It's Your Turn, which contains a practical set of tools and investigations to help people realize that they are not separate from the rest of reality. Angelo's work does an excellent job of breaking this process down into stages, from the initial awakening and insights around the constructed nature of self, through to the integration and realization of this insight in everyday life, and ultimately liberation from suffering. You can find a large library of material on this subject at his YouTube channel, Simply Always Awake, or at simplyalwaysawake.com. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Angelo Dilullo. Angelo, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So we're going to be talking today about, there's a lot of different words for the stuff that you point to in your work. Awakening, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. But maybe we can begin with is your day job that you're an anesthesiologist?
Yeah, actually, it's a night job now because I'm on nights, but I am an anesthesiologist full time. Yeah.
Right. That seems, I've not seen you speak about it, but it seems kind of, I'm not sure if it's ironic or related somehow that your career is altering people's consciousness.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose I've always been pretty fascinated with states of consciousness. But a lot of people make the joke or the comment that in my day job, I put people to sleep, and my pastime or my hobby, I wake people up and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, hopefully you wake people up at the end in your day, in your night job as well.
That's what I get paid for.
Right. In a different way.
Right.
Yeah. And actually, not to dive straight into maybe some of the more heady stuff, but part of what we're pointing to with this kind of non-duality awakening stuff is that kind of consciousness is unchanging and kind of can't really be altered. So do you have a sense of how that fits with what happens when someone goes under anesthesia?
Yeah, I would say in deep sleep, contentless deep sleep, which is not the same as dream sleep. That's much more like what people experience under anesthesia, that it's a contentless experience. And in fact, under anesthesia, you're in such a deep state of that unconsciousness that you actually can't even respond to the environment. Whereas in deep sleep at night in your home, often you can respond to the environment. Sometimes you can't, or sometimes you don't. But like a loud sound may wake you up. So there's something aware, but there's certainly no self-consciousness. And that which is aware, we could call that awareness or bare awareness, has this sort of unchanging, unmutable, in one sense, always present aspect to it. And this becomes clearer and clearer experientially as realization deepens, that it's always there. It's always here. It's just that it's like there's layers of experience on top of it. There's layers of experiencing going on that are sort of built on top of that in one way of speaking.
Yeah, I think to me a huge stumbling block in consciousness science is that the lack of kind of contemplative experience amongst consciousness scientists means that they mistake a self being present for consciousness being present. So with anesthesia, they'll point to that, right, and say that there's no memory of it. It seems like experience goes away. And to me, that doesn't mean that bare consciousness itself has disappeared during anesthesia. It just means that maybe your memory processing, your ability to create a sense of self has gone away, but there's no reason to believe that bare consciousness isn't still there. But a lot of people, I've had I almost had a paper rejected because someone couldn't believe this was possible. They were just like, you're doubting the most obvious thing in the world, which is that consciousness is completely obliterated by anesthesia, like at every single layer. So yeah, I think it's I share your intuition that it remains, and I also notice, I think people can try when they're going to sleep. You can notice no matter how sleepy you are, and maybe this is even easier sometimes if you're really sleepy, that drowsiness is an appearance within consciousness. Consciousness itself isn't drowsy and sleepy and heavy. It's wide awake, and you kind of the you that feels sleepy falls asleep within that wide awake consciousness.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's how I experience it. And the point, or the bit the point you made about self is actually really, really important, I would say. Although I would say it's a pretty uncommon realization. I do know people who have realized this, and this is the crux of Buddhism. Actually, is anatta, no self. You can be wide awake and experience no self whatsoever. So, in my experience, and I'm using these terms "my" and "me" conventionally. There's no other way to talk about this. There's no sense of self at all. There's just no sense of self. It's gone. I don't even remember what it's like. So someone could say, well, how can you function? And I would just say this environment just functions. It's very simple. Just how a flower functions, how the sky functions, how a nuclear explosion functions, how mitochondria function. None of that has to have a self. The self that we experience is a reflection in consciousness. It's like imputed onto the world, onto what the experience, but it's not necessary at all, not at all. And that is very, very difficult from the framework of a self, from the framework of egoic consciousness to imagine. It's not even possible to imagine. You can't imagine it because you would have to use dualistic thought to imagine it. It's not imaginable, but it's definitely possible. And it's quite a radical way to experience when it first shifts, but you also get used to it as well.
Right. So, I think to imagine it kind of would be to actualize it. You can't make your mind configure into that shape without actually doing it. So
it's impossible.
Yeah. I mean, so it'd be interesting to kind of bounce off some differences in our experience, because so I had a kind of awakening experience when I was about 13, and then I spent about 15 years living in a very bypassy way, where it was kind of like I would say I generally, as I was going about my day, felt like a self, and often kind of quite a depressive self. And then but I always had the ability to cut through that. I could always shift and just be aware that everything just is. Sure, there's a feeling of depression, but it's just a feeling. It's not me. It's just arising. And then I eventually started doing kind of more classic psychotherapeutic, embodied emotional processing stuff. And then on a more relative level, came more and more into alignment with that awakeness. But so for me, I would say I still, as I go about my day, there's still a paradigm of identity, and that I find it useful for there to be a kind of a module that is a self that functions as a self. And so I guess it's like this analogy is coming on the fly, so maybe it won't work. But if someone gives you a menu and it's numbered, and you say, I'll have item number 3, if you think item number 3 exists in some objective sense, as opposed to being a convention we use to convey a message so the chef prepares a certain meal, that's how I experience self, I guess, is as a relative useful construct. So if you say James, in the same way if I say Angelo, you totally know I'm talking to you. So it still exists as a useful relative construct. But if you were to say to me, but what happens to James after he dies? Like, where is James? I would say that doesn't make sense. Like, where is item number 3? It doesn't exist. It's a convention. It's so I would say my everyday experience is probably relatively conventional, except that whenever I look, there's no confusion. There's no one seeking. There's no the paradigm of identity is immediately seen through as if you think of it as something where things are reified. I've just realized I'm monologuing now, and I came here for you to talk about your experience, but I feel like it can be quite subtle once someone's had a kind of awakening and integrated it, talking about what this sense of self is. Is it completely gone? Is it useful? I feel like that's quite a fruitful area for discussion. So I'll leave the floor open to you to come back with whatever that raises for you.
Yeah. So it's difficult for me to tell, because what you're describing sounds clear to me. when we talk about this, it's such a subtle thing we're talking about. And also, it's very paradoxical in the sense that, as you know, when things shift and there's just this sort of clarity, you know that it's not my clarity. It's not like this happened to me and those people out there are asleep. You know that there is some extra layer of functioning because people tell it to you. They literally speak from it. And at the same time, you know that this clarity is true of everything and everyone. It's not like a special thing, right? So to talk about this as if it's something special or remarkable or an added experience on top of any other experience is backwards. So this gets very paradoxical to even speak about it. So I'm saying this for anyone listening, that it's not a special thing that's only achievable by certain people. It's not an added experience on top of what you normally experience. It's really just seeing very, very clearly, unequivocally clearly, what is actually going on underneath. And when that happens at such a deep level, something about the way we experience identity changes permanently, and it doesn't change. It can't change back in my experience. And so that last couple of layers of what we call, what I might call perceptual filtering of experience, they're subtle. They're very subtle, but when they shift, it's not so subtle. It can be quite dramatic depending on your situation and your conditions and so forth. But your analogy of, like, if you have a menu and there's, I'll take item number 3, 2, 1 in the moment, and it's a conventional choice or a conventional designation in that moment. I can relate to that. The thing I would say, and this may be your experience, you may be talking about exactly the same experience, is I might say on my menu, there's only 6 choices. There's the 5 sense gates, and then there's consciousness. And there's nothing between those. There's nothing mitigating any response to any of them. There's nothing managing any of that. There's nothing collating that experience into one whole experience. There is no background. There's no internal world. All of that just doesn't exist. So, and again, I know this also doesn't exist for anyone else. And yet somehow the mind makes this pattern of reflection that makes it appear as if something is built on top of that, called a self, called a reactive self, called a choosing self. I just don't have that. And so for me, I might say, sure, conventionally speaking, there might be a choice, like my attention will go into sound right now, and there's just sound. My attention might go into the gut right now, into the sensations, or in the chest or the breath, just sensations. There's not thinking about breath or thinking about sensations or thinking about me, the breather or the sensor. There's just that. There's literally nothing else, and it is everything. And it also has no abiding reality either. As you mentioned, it's conventional. There's actually no number 3, right? So there's no breath there either. And the distinction I would make is there's no one deciding that any of that's happening, and there's nothing back onto which to reflect what's happening anymore. So so that's how I might say it. Those there is that menu of conventional experiences or appearances, but how that menu is managed and or the responses to it mitigated and so forth, just there's nothing there. There's no substance to any of it, and most importantly, there's no collating entity or basis for any of it. And then it's seen there's no basis for anything, which is very strange, but it's also just like right in front of my face all the time. I can never ignore that. In one sense, I can never forget for a moment that there's nothing behind anything. So it becomes very, very, very difficult to talk about. And in one sense, there's no reason to talk about it. The only reason I have to talk about it is if somebody is moving through the process, or in a case like this, where we're talking about it specifically for an audience that may be interested. But it's not like I walk around talking about it, and I certainly don't think about it. It's just very obvious. So it is a lived experience more than a understood experience.
Right. I'm not sure if you said a hall of mirrors, but you said something like that I resonated with me, because that's kind of very much how I think about the self, as like there's some kind of almost geometric trick is happening in consciousness that gives the illusion that there's something else other than consciousness there, and that functions to help you achieve certain things. But I would say it sounds like there is a subtle difference in our experience. So that for me, I would say there is that constellation of reflections that creates a self that functions. But then whenever I choose to look, it's really obvious. It's just a bunch of reflections. But when I'm not pointing back, when I'm not just kind of choosing to stop and reflect, if I'm just kind of writing an email, I'm kind of in it. I'm functioning through that module of a self. But there's no, a good example is like if I stub my toe, there is immediate reactivity of like a kind of tensing of like, oh no, I didn't want that to happen. But then it's an immediate wake up call to go like, happen to who? Like there's no, this isn't an issue. It's just an intense thing. But there is a residue of self, I guess, that it kind of bounces off of. But it sounds maybe in your experience, it's more stable and kind of constant, this kind of open, way of just being perpetually awake with no structured self in experience.
Yeah, that's how I would say it. And that residue that you described it very well, the residue of self, it can kind of hang around for a while and then just drop out totally. And everyone reacts to that difference. And some people really are disturbed by that. But they, like what I've seen is sometimes the belief was still there somewhere that I'm getting somewhere. I'm moving through some life. I'm moving through time. I'm getting better at things. I'm becoming more spiritual or more awake, or there's just some residue of that. And then that just disappears. And there's like, no, that's the hard thing to talk about, but there's no inner world. There's nothing collecting experience or absorbing experience or enjoying experience. It's just pure experience. And in one set way, you could say it very much enjoys itself, but it also obliterates itself instantly. There's nothing holding back going, cool. It's just full on, right? And I'm sure actually you do experience it like ongoing periodically. Like, so when you said if you're engaged in an email, you might be feeling like the self engaging in the email, but I'm sure there's other times if you're, say, speaking to somebody very presently, you just feel presence. You're not pre-thinking anything. The words are literally just coming. So I think we're present more than we realize, but that self-structure just sneaks in here and there just to remind us that it's there, to make us feel this is giving it more volition than it has, but it sort of makes us feel like, oh yeah, you're still a self. And then there's just a subtle belief that actually believes it, and then it just suddenly doesn't. And then consciousness feels just like a sense. It's like a sense gate, like sound or something. And there's nothing moving between those sense gates. That's maybe the better way I would say it for my own experience.
Yeah. And the thing you said about the kind of the email being written as opposed to feeling like you're the person writing the email, part of the reason we're having this conversation is I feel like your path to talking about this stuff in public has been because you are good at communicating and pointing to this stuff, and people have kind of encouraged you, it sounds like, to talk about it. And you certainly came to my attention because people in my audience were enjoying your work and said that I might enjoy it as well. And using that analogy, it was useful in my experience to remind me, up until this point in the conversation, I did feel like I was the one speaking these words, that James was intentionally speaking these words. But then that was a nice reminder that actually now I feel very much like these words were arising. They're coming as much as I'm not willing to see the chair in front of me. It's just arising. And the same way these words are just coming out. So it's, you're very good at inviting people just to come back to this awake state. And it's also points back to the paradox that, we're focusing on these really subtle differences. And then I almost convinced myself that maybe there is a difference in our experience, but then there's this sense of like, of course there can't be. It's all just, everything's equally awake in the same way. So it's somehow, it becomes, I'm worried now we're just going to crash into the non-conceptual and just kind of find it hard to progress in the conversation. I'm actually now at a crossroads where I have a lot of avenues I could go and to structure this. And I usually go in with a lot of, and I've done the same with you, a lot of planning for different avenues we could take it in. But I feel like trusting the spontaneity that arises with the present moment is what this whole thing is about. So if you're open to it, I might, instead of leading you with questions to say, oh, let's go in this direction, I wonder if we instead kind of go back and forth in a spontaneous conversation.
Absolutely. That's how I experience it anyway. For me, I can't pre-think anything, like, especially when I'm doing something like this. When people invite me or when I'm going to interview someone, I can't pre-think it. Like even if I did, it wouldn't go that way. So, and I know that. So I speak always from just this intimacy and presence, and it works really. That's the fascinating thing, is it does there is a sort of step off at some point, and maybe it happens at over a period of time in life where you trust it utterly. You lean into it and just really trust to be completely unprepared. But what I found is when I have done that, and now it's pretty much all the time when I'm speaking with people and so forth, that's when the most profound effects occur. And often I don't even know it till later. People will tell me like, wow, that thing we talked about, I don't know what it did, but it unbound something in me or whatever. And when I'm speaking in this way, I don't feel, it doesn't feel special. It just feels like what's happening. But there's clearly a sort of an awareness of everything right now. It's like vibrantly alive. The sensations, the color, your face, the colors, the sounds of the voice. I don't even know whose voice it is. It's just coming. I don't know why it's coming. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know where these sensations are coming from, but there they are. And this simplicity and willingness to just sort of be raw, but also let this flow just come, works. For whatever reason it works. It has a timing to it. It has a synchronicity is what I find in life.
Right. Yeah. I think my initial instinct when I started speaking in public was to do something approximating what you're doing. And then I kind of quickly realized that I play a different role in this ecosystem, I think, which is that you said how you can't prepare, or if you try to prepare for something, it won't go the way you planned. For me, the structure of my mind, and again, this is the residue of self thing, probably, that seems to work quite well. There's a part of me that likes to control and doesn't like, I would say, surrender and control are both very alive within me. And my journey has been one of seeing how they relate to each other, seeing how they can work together. So I'm not someone who has just completely, well, again, falling into the paradox of hard to talk about here, but I'm not coming from the same place of view of just, I think of pointing to everyone just to the open, allowing, surrender stuff. I do point to that, but I'm also almost engaging with the intellectual edifices of philosophy and all that kind of stuff to show people it's safe to surrender, to instead of just pointing to it and trying to wake people up to it. It's like, well, actually this fits here and this is why it's not crazy and you don't have to worry about, it's not a mental health episode and all of that stuff, whilst trying to always be like, but this talking about it isn't the actual thing. You have to then go and jump off.
I think there's huge value to that. There's huge value to that because I'll make an analogy that's maybe a little overly dramatic, but it's like, if you're in a battle situation and you're a soldier and you go rescue one of your fellow soldiers from a really bad situation, you bring them out, then the next question is, do I go back in and rescue someone else and put myself in danger again? Back and forth. And so it is a challenge, and it's a skill really when realization clarifies to be able to like function both in that world of mind identification and bring that out, help walk somebody out of that and just say, hey, look, it's okay. Just take a step in this direction, and I think that requires a lot of nuance and your own, it requires intelligence, nuance, and understanding of the way the human mind functions, but it's also a compassionate movement. So I know what you're talking about. It's not easy.
Yeah, definitely the Bodhisattva path of kind of compassion, trying to build bridges to help people move into this stuff is definitely where my heart is at. And it's, I would say so the thing, as you pointed to, this stuff is it's so simple. It's already kind of how everything is in a sense. Everything is ultimately okay and aligned and moving in the way it's going to go. Yet at the same time, there can be this call to participate and to help people move in this direction. And so for me, it's all about that. It's about not. So this is why your work resonates as well, is as I see a real authenticity and in the spiritual kind of space, there can be a lot of egoic playing with image, I think, and like, I can position myself as being really special, and like, as you pointed to earlier, this isn't something that's special that someone has and someone else doesn't, in a way that makes them superior or anything like that. But I see in you a kind of a genuine desire to help and communicate and to transmit as effectively as possible. And so when I think in trying to unpack the ideas side of things as well, it's about taking people from where they're at, because if they're holding on to ideas, if they're functioning in a very heady space, it's because it can often be because things have happened that mean it's not safe to surrender, or it hasn't felt safe to surrender, or yeah, we live in a crazy world where often it doesn't feel, if you don't empower yourself to navigate in the world, just being like, hey, just wake up and surrender, everything will go fine, can be not the wisest or fully integrated piece of advice.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's like, oh no, actually, you know what? I'm always gonna have the instinct to go back into questions. I'll bounce back to you.
Sure. Yeah. So what came up when you said that was a couple of things. One is there was a quote by Osho I heard once that I think is reasonably true. And he said, in one sense, you almost have to have a well-formed ego to deconstruct the ego, and I think what I took from that is that, hold everything with a grain of salt, anyone who's listening. But what I took from that is I have seen people who really haven't developed themselves in life in various ways that make them sort of vulnerable in practical ways to just not doing well in life and so forth. And sometimes I think you have to really develop yourself, like whether it's through career or relationship or something, confidence, even just confidence in general, that you can be effective in the world before you take on this process, because it can be so steep. And you still have a conventional persona, you still have a conventional life, and if that hasn't been well formed and you start to let go of everything in the sort of space of consciousness or the identity space, what do you have left? Like, you may become dysfunctional, sort of that sort of thing. And a lot of it really isn't it isn't like actually true. It's really about confidence. A lot of times it's really about your confidence that you can function in the human realm, which is a difficult place to function, actually, because of mind identification. So I think there is some value to really looking at yourself and going, can I handle the steepness of this path? And that's why I give a lot of cautions. And I do trust people to trust their own instincts, because we share the same, we could say we share the same true nature. There's something in us that really does know when it's time to work through this process and when it's time not to. And sometimes it just happens. So that's it. It is what it is. But I think there is some value to knowing that you can check in with yourself and see, like, have I sort of done what I need to do in the conventional life to my own satisfaction before I really take on this process that's going to look into and potentially undermine what I take myself to be, because that's a big thing to do. And it's life-changing, right? So that's one thing that I thought of when you were speaking, is to say that. The other area is like people who I think tend towards a lot of disassociation. This may not be the best thing for them right now. They're often very clear people, energetically clear, but I find they often have a lot of really repressed emotion and they haven't done a lot of work around that. And so this can be not the best idea, because what happens then is you bypass, like on steroids. It's really it becomes a massive bypassing thing, which is not a good idea. So there are some groups of people where I wouldn't say you can't wake up. You definitely can. Anyone can. But sometimes there are some things to address first, or look into a little more deeply before you start doing like hardcore self-inquiry or something like that. So I don't even know what you said. I can't remember, but somehow I thought.
Neither can I. Can you expand what you mean by energetically clear?
Oh, yeah, it's interesting. More and more over the years, I've just become aware that some people are more in this moment, meaning in the timeline of right now, meaning they could be more clear later easily, and this can shift for anyone at any time. But some people, I just bump into them in public and they're just more clear. They're more present. I can look at a group of people, and most people, they're in their heads. They're thinking, they're kind of internal. And then there's one person who's just wide open and they're just completely aware of everything going on in the room. And it's so obvious to me. It's really funny. It stands out when I see this. And I don't know, it's like one out of a couple hundred people, maybe. I was with a group of friends actually at Disneyland, and we were in line at a ride. This was a few weeks ago. We were in line at a ride, in line on a ride, and it was like indoors. So there were probably 70 or 80, maybe more like 100 people in this room. And I was with a group of friends who are very much awake. And I just noticed this lady, and she was like across the room. And I told my friends, I said, there's one person in this room that's extremely present. Can you tell who it is? And they all looked around and they picked her out right away. And it was just this mom with the family, and she was with her family across the room over there. But everyone else is like in their minds and talking about conversations, and you can just tell they're in that world of mind identification that's sort of shared among the other people. And she was completely wide open. She just like wide awake in the room, aware. It was so fascinating. So some people are definitely clear like that. And I find that people I've interacted with that tend towards disassociation, depersonalization, derealization, they tend to be very clear, actually. But they also often have these sort of like really limiting beliefs about their own ability to function in life, and some emotional repression patterns that have occurred. That's what I find. So often they do really well once they take up like therapy and doing emotion work, but often are disinclined to do that. Right. And so someone in that situation, that's what I was referring to. But there are definitely people who are more present just for whatever reason right now. And again, that can change for anyone at any time.
Right. I thought you were going to say it was the guy in the Mickey Mouse costume or something who was really awake. You got a bit of walking around as the mascot.
Yeah, it's funny that it happened. I've seen it one time. I have another example. I remember like I was sitting in Starbucks one time, and I think I was writing, actually. I was writing years ago, like the preamble to my book or something, or precursor to what I would have put in my book. And I was there, and this young woman who was probably 23, 24 walked in, and it was the way she was moving, how present she was. It was crazy. And I just thought, wow. And when I see people like that, sometimes I'll ask them, I'll say, I'll just say, hey, you're very, very present in this environment. Like most people aren't so present. Are you aware of that? And I don't know why I would ask that. I wouldn't ask it every time, but sometimes I will ask somebody that. And this one was really wild because she just started crying. Like her tears were coming down, and she was like, oh, it's been like this my whole life. I don't know what to do. I feel like I don't fit in. And, I've had this kind of conversation with people many, many times, but to just randomly see somebody and walk up and ask them about that has happened a handful of times, and it's pretty remarkable. So I don't know. I can just pick it out sometimes.
Right. I'm really interested in talking to you about the kind of emotional work side of things, because I've seen you speak about in terms of kind of stages of awakening where you described it just now as a kind of steep ascent, and then perhaps the emotional work kind of comes in the aftermath as things are processed. I'm also interested in your thoughts on the other way around. If someone engaging, I think you pointed towards this with people who have maybe dissociation and issues like that, if they're on a path of doing psychotherapeutic emotional healing work, if that can be a gradual path towards it as a kind of maybe a softer landing to do that alongside awakening practices.
Yeah, I think it certainly can. I think I usually suggest to people feel in and trust your instinct about how to take this path. And if it's usually pretty obvious to me when someone's like really ready to wake up. They'll tell me something like, everything's failed in my life. Like I can do things, I can function and so forth, but nothing has delivered satisfaction. And there's been something following me my whole life, and I need to address it. And when they start talking about awakening, they're like, that's it right there. They know. And so sometimes it's just that obvious for people. And so when I encounter someone like that, I just say, strike while the iron's hot. Like, don't worry about anything else. Just go for it. And I point them very, very directly, and they can usually handle it. Other times it's not so much like that. They're interested in awakening. They're interested in spirituality or Buddhism, but they'll even sometimes say, hey, I'm not ready for that yet. It's just too much or too steep, or I have a lot of fear around this, or they just keep getting distracted with various things. Often someone in that setting, it's hugely valuable for them to do emotion work. And that's both on the spectrum of waking up and also just on the personal spectrum of enjoying your life and functioning well in life and getting along with people and all of it. So I let people or I encourage people to trust their instincts on when to do emotion work. Now, in the first case, when somebody's just full on ready to wake up, that's awesome. That's what happened to me. I didn't have any emotion work behind me when I woke up. I needed to do it later, but I needed to wake up, and I suffered so much. There was just no other way out. And I had to do it. So in that first case, I don't really tell people to worry about emotional work and so forth, unless it comes up in the process. If I'm working directly with somebody and they're kind of approaching awakening and this emotional block comes up or something, I'll always address it. I don't say ignore anything, but generally speaking, I just point them directly towards awakening, and then they wake up and they have a honeymoon period, and then the emotion work starts showing you its face. It's like, okay, we need to work here. Yeah, so that's the first case. On the second case, with the emotion work, I just kind of dance with the person a little bit about, what do they want to work with, and what are they ready to work with in the emotion spectrum, and what they're, more cautious around. And it's just a layered thing. So sometimes you're more comfortable with certain emotions and certain, narratives in your life that have created emotional states. And then once you work with those, you have a little more confidence and trust in the emotional space, and you just have more familiarity there. And then you can go into more challenging emotions. And there, I don't use the term negative emotions because I just don't see it that way at all. I see it as more like repressed emotions, and they're more like energies to me that just need attention. And the more you're able to give them attention and space, the more they soften, and then they start to look very different. And they're just energies that have been neglected by us and our parents and their parents and all of humanity. And so the more you address those, the clearer things get, the more life starts to really flow. And then at some point, people who start out that way, all of a sudden are much more interested in identity. Yeah.
Yeah, that I completely align with that perspective of there being no negative emotions, only challenging emotions that need your attention and need your kind of compassionate awareness. And that allows them to kind of open and soften and provide you with the information you need, whatever you need to hear. For me, a big part of this, what I'd like to talk to you about, I guess, is, why is there a sense of separation at all? And it seems to me very tied up with issues around trauma, fear, trying to navigate in the world effectively. And part of the process of coming into alignment with the world and feeling like it's safe to come into alignment with the world is to learn from your experiences, unpack your traumas and your emotional challenges, so that then you can be a more functional person. If you're going to bypass your traumas, then I think you're not going to be as integrated. You may end up causing harm because there are parts of yourself that, we've seen this a lot in the 20th century of kind of abuse scandals in different kind of Buddhist institutions, things like that. Most people have to be told that gurus can sometimes be abusive. And so this piece of navigation, the idea that someone who's in a really tricky situation where they've got a lot of work to do to get to a place of being functional, it's simultaneously true that it would be wise for them to do that work, but it's also true that they already just are, in the way that they have Buddha nature, or whatever term you want to use. They are also capable of just recognizing the fact that they are wide awake and that everything is where it needs to be. How do you see those two things kind of fitting together?
You may have to rephrase that question.
Yeah, it's a tricky. When you have someone who is already kind of the thing we're talking about, is awake, I think Buddha nature is a useful idea, but they're in a place in their life where there's a lot of material work to be done, psychotherapeutic work. Maybe they're in an abusive relationship and stuff like that, where it would be bypassy to say to them, "Hey, just notice you're already enlightened, and then everything will be fine."
Right.
It's simultaneously true that from one perspective, the universe is unfolding exactly as it will, and everything is perfect. But from another perspective, they really need to change their life. So I guess to me, those two truths are they're true at the same time. And I'm interested how you see that.
Sure. Yeah, totally. So I think what we're talking about in one sense is a simple way of saying is bypassing. And the extreme cases of bypassing are what you mentioned, is like, abusive teachers, abusive gurus. We have contemporary ones right now who are out there and have followings and stuff. And it's that actually is interesting to me, because it's a very certain setup that seems to lead into that. And I think it's someone with a bit of a narcissistic tendency, but for whatever reason, they often have a first shift or a first awakening, and they do have a lot of clarity, and they can sort of transmit. They can in a way transmit. There's a feeling of being around them that they feel clear and whatever, but they really have a lot of emotion work that is just not being done, and it's being overtly ignored and circumvented by the position of being a teacher and the illusion that they're setting up with, I'm the enlightened one and you're the unenlightened ones, my students, my inner circle. And then they're also in complicity with it because of they're also contributing to the delusion that I'm the unenlightened one and you're the enlightened one. And so this whole thing can get set up. Hopefully we're deconstructing that. And that's one of the reasons truly I wrote the book, because I would look around and see this happening. I'm like, this is insane that this is still happening. There are liberated people who don't want anything from you really, and they're willing to teach, and they're out there, and there's great videos and great books, and then why would people fall for this stuff still? Because it's just so silly, in one sense. But it's not silly when you're in it and your emotional landscape sets you up to make so that looks real to you, and then once you're in it, it's kind of hard to get out. And so that's an extreme version of spiritual bypassing with one person at the head that is reasonably narcissistic, I think, and just has a lot of emotional work they're not doing at all. But the not so extreme versions of it, in one sense, I think we can all relate to. Anyone who's gone through awakening, that you do wake up to, initially especially, that you wake up to this unbound consciousness, this knowing of this consciousness that is just here. It's not caused. You don't have to earn it. And it's very freeing. It's very freeing when all of those beliefs about your life and the narrative and your past and future just melt into this consciousness, and there's nowhere to go, and there's nothing you need to do anymore. And it's very enjoyable, and it's intimate, right? That anyone who has an initial awakening knows that. They know that place, and it's a very direct experience, a very real experience. And at first, especially, you can, with good conscience, you can use that to just calm everything, calm the mind, calm the narratives, calm the struggle. And it does work. And I think it continues to work. But what I think happens is at some point you're called to do something else in addition to that. And that is drop down into here, into the attachment to form. This is attachment to thoughts and concepts that you break free of. You break free of the attachment to I am my thoughts, I am my beliefs, I am my narrative, my history. But there's a deeper attachment that it's rooted in, that is I am this body and I am form. And that's a harder one to get to, because if you conceptualize it or you philosophize it, it's you can talk endlessly about it, but you can totally miss it too. It's a very visceral experience, as you know. And so that's when it's like, when that starts to call you, it's like, it's time to do emotion work. And it can be challenging, because if you're really disinclined to do that, it's almost like, well, you don't want to do it and no one's going to tell you to do it. So even if they do tell you to do it, you don't want to hear it. So it can be kind of challenging. All I can really do is just normalize it. I try to normalize the other things that go along with this whole process, like fear barrier that you often go through when you wake up, shame. I talk about shame a lot. I talk about self-doubt. I talk about these things that if you don't talk about them, the momentum of the mind, and especially the tendency to sort of want to just dissolve yourself into consciousness, especially after awakening, can be so tempting that it's just easy to continue to overlook them. So what I try to do is I just try to normalize it and say, hey, this is going to happen. You're going to come in contact with things that are very uncomfortable. And the fact that you woke up actually took a lot of the barriers you were using to avoid this out of the way. So it's grace that you can feel this directly, that you can realize you actually feel shame, that you can realize you actually feel intense fear. Whereas when your mind identified, you may not even have known you felt fear. And that's a very strange thing, but it's common, right? So I just try to normalize. I try to just direct people, and I say it in different ways. And I try to weave it into these conversations of like, hey, maybe you're feeling some fear there. Maybe, especially if someone wants to, there's a feel to it when they really want to bypass and they want to keep telling me, hey, it's all awareness, it's all spirit, it's all this and that. But in the conversation, that's not what I'm feeling. I'm feeling they're avoiding something, or I'm feeling their fear, sometimes anger. You get once you've done a lot of emotion work yourself, and there's no end to it really, but once you've done a lot of emotion work yourself, you start to really intuit things more, I think. And I'm sure you can relate. You can feel what people are feeling. You can be talking to someone about this, and that's not what's happening. What's happening is this. You're feeling this, and it's like loud, right? And you just want to tell that person, just feel the sadness. Like, come on, let's just feel it together, But it's not always appropriate to say that in a spiritual context, or in this context where I'm facilitating or working with someone, it is more appropriate to say that. But even then, often people are resistant. But I'll kind of work with them through their story and narrative to get back to what I'm feeling with them is like, do you think there might be some fear here? Do you think there might be some? And often people will just be like, oh my God, yes. How did I not see that? And then we're doing emotion work. So that's what I do. I just try to weave it into the conversation. I try to normalize it and just teach that this is part of the deal for sure.
Yeah, that's really great and really important. And the fact that you can have repressed emotional stuff that you're not aware of, yet you can feel wide awake, is a really interesting thing. And I think that's what makes it possible. You're talking about people who, like, why, when there are lots of liberated people who are teaching who won't be abusive, why do people gravitate? Sometimes certain people gravitate towards the abusive ones. And I suspect this comes back to the navigation thing, that on some level there's some psychological processing to do in interpersonal dynamics, and who knows if it's parental dynamics or whatever, but they're like, something about this charismatic person who's actually quite nasty to me. I need to figure out, how do I navigate this? And that's a very, it's on some level, it's coming from a place of wanting to grow and heal, but often we can get stuck in, it's not, unless it's really being brought to awareness in the way that you're saying you work with people, where you're really having to move into the emotions, feel the emotions, process them. Like, you can just get stuck in a loop. And I think that, I'd love to get into shame with you, because I think that's a really, it's almost the definition of the opposite of being awake is it's hiding things, right? It's about kind of wanting to keep parts of yourself from being seen, even from yourself, repressing it, not even wanting to go near it. And also, it's interesting the way with the way our attention works with repression. It doesn't even have to be that you're forcing something down. It can just be that as soon as you get near something, your attention's just sliding away from it, constantly sliding out. So it's always out of view. And so it's not that it's even being hidden in any kind of profound way. And you can feel it when it's coming up, and you're just kind of inviting someone to turn their attention back to it. So yeah, I wonder if you could speak a bit about shame.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Your description is clear. I think, in my experience, is like, when we talk about repressing emotions, we talk about all this kind of stuff can feel very heavy, and people listening some will definitely feel the heaviness of this, and that's fine. That's the nature of it. But I want to point out, there's no guilty party. You're not guilty of any of this. There's no, we tend to, this has a very personal tone to it when we interpret it, when we take it in. Like, when we start to move down to the emotion body, there's a lot of like self-doubt and self-blame and all this stuff. And a lot of it's rooted in our childhoods. But I just want to point out that what we're talking about here actually, in the end, turns out to be quite impersonal. These are like programs that run, but they run very deeply in us. And part of what makes them continue to run and to run under the radar, to escape our notice, is that they have this flavor of, you better hide this hyper personality. It's like hyper personal. Like, oh, this is about you, and there's this part of you that's just, you don't want to look at it. You definitely don't want anyone else to see it. So just bury it, right? That's the feeling of shame. What's strange is there's nothing in it. There's nothing at the core of that at all. There's, when you really just let it go, and you just realize whatever's here is here. What I feel is what I feel. The sensations are the sensations. The interpretations are the interpretations, and you own it all, and you don't hide anything from anyone or yourself. All of a sudden, there's just nothing there. There's nothing to hide, and it's a very freeing experience. But for a long time, we don't even realize that we're hiding, how much we're hiding and repressing and pushing down. But shame, if it had a voice, it would just say, "Don't look here." It would say, "Just do not look here. Like, this is the last place you want to look. Look anywhere else but here. Go distract yourself. Go watch porn, go, buy stuff, go smoke a joint, whatever you do to distract yourself." It just points the arrows outward. And this is why for a long time, people often aren't even realizing that they're repressing emotions. Like, they might say, "I don't have shame," or whatever. It's because the tendencies are already in place. The structures of attention are already in place to completely avoid this space. But once you start to either very purposely inquire into it, or you really want to feel into what's going on underneath the surface, or you have an awakening and you just literally can't ignore it, then it's like, okay, well, let's turn those arrows inward and let's just go down and feel what's here. And it can feel at first very intense. It can feel energetically restless. Like, it's like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to go here. I want to move somewhere else. I want to go somewhere else. It's built on that kind of restlessness. But its message is something like, there's something in here you don't want to see. There's something in here that's corrupt. There's something in here that's so bad, it's just, it has to remain hidden. And that's not what's actually there. It's what's there is a sensation. What's there is an emotion. But that's the barrier to it that makes it so it can be very tricky to go into it and to finally just settle and feel what's actually there. And what I find, I would suggest anyone who is inclined to do this work, who's interested in going where I'm pointing, do it. Like, for sure, you have the capacity to go there, and just feel into it. You can do it through inquiry, or you can just stop running, stop trying to escape, stop distracting, and just feel what's there. And what you often find is what's actually at the core of that is something much more tender and sweet and simple and innocent than you could have ever imagined. But you have to go there to know that, really, and to find that part of yourself. And it's probably the most important part of the shadow work, or the emotion work, or one of the 2 or 3 most important aspects to it would be working through that shame. And people experience it differently. Some people might experience it as this massive self-doubt. Other people might even experience it as self-hatred. I've heard all of these iterations of it, but it's just hugely valuable to be able to go down into that and know that when you go out into that, you sort of lose perspective in that moment, and that's okay. That's normal for the emotion body. In the mental space, you kind of have this infinite perspective, especially after a shift, is this infinite perspective of consciousness, and it feels very freeing and expansive. When you come down into the emotion body, it can be surprising because you sort of lose perspective. You become the emotion, you become the fear, you become the sadness, and it's okay, but you have to sort of surrender your body to it in that moment. And you're not going to stay there forever, but it tends to be intense for short periods of time, is what I find. So those are just guideposts for people who are interested in this work.
Right. And it seems like if you're doing this work post-awakening, it's like awareness becomes a kind of a safe vessel to do this work in, right? Because it's like it's unaffected by whatever arises in it. It's this pristine, open, safe place. But more and more I feel, whenever I work with people, that it's challenging experiences can arise. People can become destabilized and have really difficult dissociative kind of derealization experiences, especially when they're doing this kind of emotional work. So I always point people to kind of grounding exercises to kind of help them just connect to a kind of more ordinary state of consciousness, where you're just situated in your environment and you're connecting with a sense of safety. And if it's and kind of looking out for your, really building up your ability to navigate and empower yourself, so that if something feels actually it's a bit too much for you right now, listen to that, be gentle with yourself. No need to push. And so I was going to ask if you agree with that, but it sounds like you do.
I do. Yeah. I just, like I said earlier, I trust people's own instinct on this. If they say too much, that's fine. Of course. Yeah. There's a lot of ways to sort of calm the body mind to just changing environments is hugely helpful. Go out and take a walk in nature, lay on the ground, go anything into the physical senses of the body. With anyone who's disassociating or derealization, and that reorienting to the physical senses is very, very, very helpful. And that can be through taking a bath, or just feeling your hands on the floor, feeling your hands on your skin. And sometimes when somebody's really disassociated, they'll say, I don't feel anything. There's nothing here. There's no one. There's, and I'll say, pinch your skin. Do you feel that? Oh yeah, I do feel that. Okay. That's your finger on the surface of your skin. Now just touch your skin. Do you feel the surface? Do you feel the contact point? Oh yeah, I feel that. Now, can you feel it a little deeper inside, like in your arm? Can you feel it inwardly? Can you feel it into your core? Sometimes I have to lead them back to the physical sensations that way. But that I found is a very good treatment immediately for any kind of disassociation, is to really just come back into the physical. But there's often a tendency not to do that. It's like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to disappear. I want to expand. But that's what becomes so disassociating, is that expansive, like it's almost what I've said before is it's an overemphasis on the disassociation, or I'm sorry, disintegrative aspect instead of the integrative aspect.
Right.
And you could say direct experience is a sort of balance between integration and disintegration constantly. There's always integration and disintegration occurring. The ninth Oxfording picture talks about this beautifully, but yeah, there can be this massive skew to the disintegrative. So again, that's why some people who are very clear and also tend to disassociate. It can be a challenge for them because their tendency is to continue to disassociate and go into more expansiveness instead of just actually feeling and realizing they have the capacity to feel sensations first, and then you can work through the emotions. So yeah, grounding things are very important though.
Right. And speaking of kind of dissociation and challenging experiences, people often point to post-awakening, people having a difficult time. And it's always seemed to me that if awakening is difficult, it's not so much the awakening that's difficult, because awakening itself can't, to me, it's synonymous with being just really kind of perfectly grounded and just in, as you said earlier, perfectly intimate with everything. But it's that stuff that needs to be processed, whether it's memories or challenging embodied experiences. To me, that's the difficult stuff that's being invited out. Awakening itself isn't it kind of can't be anything apart from pristine perfection in my experience. And so it's the language around this, I often feel like it's not doesn't sound right to me. But at the same time, I appreciate when people warn people that this may not just be a walk in the park, that you're just going to kind of wake up and everything's going to be really easy. That can be difficult work to do.
Yeah, I think the way I described it in my book is probably the best way to say it, and that is, when you have those experiences of expansion and just complete transcendence, and I mean, it when that happens, and it can be experiential. And then when there's a shift in identity, it's kind of like everything is that way. Everything is just so light and in flow, and it's really lovely. That's sort of reality telling you this is how it actually is. But then the next thing that happens is the repressed emotional material comes to the surface, and then reality is kind of telling you, and this is why you don't experience it all the time, because there's resistance around these experiences. And so as the resistance falls from those experiences and we learn to just feel, we learn to just inhabit this body mind and the textures of being alive and all of the senses. Once we learn to really fully integrate into all the senses and inhabit that's when you see that beautiful point of connection between the integration and disintegration. And when that's in balance, it's really, really deeply freeing. It's a kind of freedom that's beyond the expansive freedom, because it's immanent and expansive and intimate and empty of any abiding nature, but also the appearances are so vibrant and alive, and non-dualistic, like clear. So that to me is a depth of clarity that you don't enjoy until you've really gone through that emotion work. And once you've gone through the emotion work, it's not like something's behind you. It's just that you've fully integrated it or largely integrated it. And you don't fear being physical. You don't fear being non-physical. You don't fear, anything anymore, really. And so that's a beautiful way to live, is without that existential or psychological fear.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
What kind of work do you do?
So I used to, until a year ago, I worked as a research neuroscientist, doing kind of just academic, non-clinical stuff. But then I left to kind of do full-time this kind of stuff, which is, so I'm writing a book at the moment on kind of consciousness, and so it's like consciousness science is my area of expertise, but I'm coming at it from this non-dual perspective. And I basically think that, I'm resistant to the metaphysical narratives in the spiritual space around consciousness being fundamental. I think I think the kind of negative theology thing of reality being non-conceptual, you really can't, it's not possible to encompass it in a concept. But if you then try and overlay a concept, I think kind of interdependence, relationality, if that's a fundamental as fundamental as you can get, it really is that there is relationship as opposed to kind of solid substance. And then within that, I think of consciousness as a form of relationality that I think kind of ironically requires attempted separation. So I think consciousness exists where there's life. The kind of consciousness you and I experience is this contact between being a living thing that's trying to pull apart from the world, but failing, but is reaching out kind of informationally. but then, it gets into semantics, because like if consciousness is relationality, then actually, and everything is relationality, I get why people say everything's consciousness, because kind of everything is like a kind of proto-consciousness. Everything is contact in that way, but it's just not. So you get to the same place where concepts start to mean nothing. But anyway, so I'm working on a book at the moment, kind of explaining that. So it's a kind of science and spirituality thing. And yeah, this is kind of why I was sharing some of my own stuff, that I spend a lot of the time in the idea space, really trying to not get. I think a lot of the people who follow my work are into the philosophical stuff, but I'm always trying to point and be like, but this isn't it. Like talking about this on podcast for hours isn't the thing. You've got to then go and do so I really appreciate what you're doing. I've kind of working on a trauma-informed gradual approach to pair with the kind of non-dual stuff, because as I said, I had a full-on kind of awakening as a teenager, but then I had a lot of trauma stuff to work through. And I tried, because I was interested in kind of democratizing awakening, I became interested in the research on psilocybin and psychedelics. So I tried psilocybin to see if it produced a similar kind of state, found that there were interesting similarities, but then it really unlocked the emotional work for me. It just kind of, the stuff I'd been avoiding, I was like, oh, here it is. And so that led to a really beautiful process of really coming into alignment, stopping bypassing after like 15 years, as I say, of bypassing. So now I work a lot in the psychedelic space, just because again and again, that seems to be where it seems to be a tool people are really using to wake up into this stuff.
For sure.
So I've kind of developed an approach to mindfulness that is trauma informed, that can be paired with psychedelic work, that's really just about safe inner navigation, safe inner exploration, so that when people come up with this, we're talking about the grounding, stuff like that. So that when people do the emotional work, they're empowered.
So a couple things. So the consciousness thing is interesting. We could talk about it sometime, but I totally agree with you. When people say everything is made out of consciousness, like the rock is made out of consciousness, like it just so bizarre to me to hear that. Like that is not how this appears to me. And I don't know if you've ever heard me in some interviews, I've talked about this. So the first shift I had with the awakening back in 97 happened at night when I was meditating, and it was just unbound consciousness. And it was a huge, huge shift for me, because I had suffered so much, and it was wonderful. It was beautiful. Everything was consciousness, And I remember knowing very clearly, this is what everyone wants. And I thought that was odd that I even thought that, because I thought, I don't know, why would I know what people want? I wasn't like in spiritual groups or anything. I just figured it out by reading 3 Pillars of Zen. It was beautiful, and it was so expansive and wonderful. And then I went to sleep, and I woke up the next morning and I sat to meditate, and I was there immediately. But then it opened to a whole other thing. Like the whole boundary of like physicality disappeared. And so it was that was more like, okay, yeah, things aren't made out of human consciousness is a blip on the radar. There's this whole other thing happening that's not a thing, but it's energetic, and it's much more like what you were describing. So the Buddhist term would be dependent origination or dependent co-arising, right? So it's very relational, and things come into being and disappear out of being, but they do it in a sort of relational way. I actually was watching this documentary called Everything and Nothing. It's about physics and the history of physics, but they described at some point, I think Paul Dirac came up with this, the Dirac equation, but the idea that even in empty space, matter comes into being, but it's matter and antimatter particles that can come into being very quickly and then obliterate themselves. So it's like physicality borrows itself from nothingness. And I'm like, that is exactly how I experience reality. Like if I could say how this is for me, it's very much like that. And it's like, it's empty, but there's the ability for things to kind of, it's like momentarily, like this momentary blip on the cosmic radar to come into being. And it's almost like an awareness, but it's just a knowingness of experience, and then disappears completely into nothingness. So it's much less like the sort of idealists maybe, and more like the materialists described maybe. I don't know. But I don't really have a philosophical stance on it necessarily. But,
so I'm very cautious about going into metaphysics, because again, people can get very attached with like, I think it's solid matter. No, I think it's like consciousness, and they're reifying these concepts. So my conservative kind of conclusion has been that the story I would like to tell that makes sense to me really aligns with what you're saying, I think, which is that the most fundamental thing there could be is nothing, because to assert that something just exists for its own sake is kind of silly. It doesn't, with no cause. and what is the nature of nothing? Well, there can be no boundaries. It's kind of synonymous with infinite, unbound. Yeah, the unbound. And if something's infinite, we know that anything that can happen will happen within it. So it's really the same as potential. So it's unbound, infinite potential. So really at the core of existence is a potent void. It's a kind of, it necessitates the existence of every event that could ever possibly unfold occurring within it. So it's non-being that implies being, but the being can only be because it's collapsing into the void constantly. So to me, that is, and it's not like this happened in the past and started the universe. It's happening right now. We're blooming into non-being, and so that's why being is empty, but it's also relational, because very much in a Taoist way, it can only exist through polarization. And as you point to with physics, there's this idea of the zero energy universe, that I think it's gravity and matter have kind of equal energy that cancel each other out. So yeah, to me, I'm glad this resonates with you, because after a lot of work, intellectual work, this is the kind of the map that I've come up with, so that I can basically say to people, like, read this book. It might be a bit heady and philosophical, but at the end of it, when you listen to Angelo talk, you won't go, oh, what's this guy talking about? Surely it's some mental health episode. But like, no, here's a philosophical framework through to the neuroscience of the self and why it totally makes sense. And then people might go, okay, I feel now I can explore this stuff. And especially if it's paired with trauma-informed, safe, again, this idea of safe inner navigation or safe inner exploration, where it's like, we're not just going to throw you in the deep end like a lot of people do with mindfulness stuff. This is really my passion, is building bridges into awakening in a way that takes people from where they're at, even if they're very scared, very separate, very in their head, very emotionally blocked, and just creating those pathways, really.
I love it, man. That's so cool. Yeah, I love that you have that emotional integration and trauma informed process, because, man, without that, I don't even know what they did in the past. Like, I just think it's very haphazard. They probably had some teachers and gurus, and you'd go live with them and live a monastic lifestyle. They probably had some that were good, that were emotionally connected, and that could help you through that.
Right.
But other times, you just grind it out for years and meditate and suffer, and it's kind of awake suffering. I think there's a lot of that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah. I think in the past as well, there's probably a self-select, and still now a self-selection process where, like, only in America, like only 14% of people have ever tried meditation. And I feel like, or anything like this. And I think that's because people with serious trauma and stuff kind of just feel it. They don't feel it, as you say, kind of trust people. They know when it's not right for them. So I'm really interested in that. The remaining kind of 86% of people who could benefit. And like, how do you not just go like, hey, we're over here and we're special and we're spiritual and we're, but instead just come at them. And that's why science is really important to me, because it's like showing you're working in public. It's like, this is safe and grounded, and we're not just kind of playing around with the silly ideas. We're trying to be reasonable. Please come on in at your own pace. Yeah, totally. Yep, exactly. And I think the answer to how do you not state the message in such a way that it sounds like, here, we're special and you need what we have, or something like that, is to actually see the world that way. Because when I look at anyone, I don't look at someone and go, oh, they're asleep. They're Buddha nature. Like it's all this is all unconditioned. It's all the unconditioned. And it's this beautiful, vibrant unknown, and even when something comes into being, apparently, in this relational way, it still never leaves the void. That's what's so wild about it. The other part I love about, we can go on and on about this, but like when it comes to physics, quantum physics is the whole idea of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that the universe is based on indeterminacy. That's exactly how it is. It's just this pure potentiality, right? And it just fascinates me, because it just intrinsically feels so much like that to me. The sort of three-dimensional world that the mind constructs, which does work for survival, and it works for to get our needs met and so forth, and gather resources and all that in different ways for different species. That's also a sort of miracle, because it makes the world look a way that it's not. But it works. But it's a way that works, for us. So it's all so fascinating, but it's all happening just as this indeterminacy. So beautiful. Yeah. And it's odd to me, the thing you're saying, everyone being good in nature, instead of patronizing you, being like, oh, they're asleep. The nature of, this is a paradox that the conceptual mind, I think, just can't really resolve. But like the way in which separation and illusion and darkness is still part of being and just is Buddha nature is really interesting to me, because in my experience, psychologically, the kind of the core of separation, the core of the mind as opposed to consciousness, it feels like when it's confronted with the awake mind, it's like it really wants to separate. It really wants to be able to zoom out to a framework where it can kind of be like, no, like I'm somehow outside of being, and like I can get outside of you, like just pure being. And the fact that it can't do that is kind of the very core of separation to me feels like that kind of struggle of form. It's like it just doesn't want to surrender into formlessness. And there really is no kind of resolution. It's like, I guess the kind of the Taoist kind of yin yang thing, where it's almost like the form and formlessness, it is just part of the thing. No matter how much the form wants to find some way out, that's almost just the energy, the kind of the engine churning whatever this process is. I don't know, words fall apart again.
Yeah, but it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I was going to say is the psychedelic thing is interesting. I don't know if you know, I live in Colorado, but Colorado, we just legalized DMT. DMT, I think ibogaine and ketamine, like they're legalized now for non-therapeutic, like for anything. And so, it's been really interesting. But I have a friend who, she works for the firm that wrote the legislation for that, and she actually was hugely influential in writing the legislation to legalize marijuana here 10 years ago or whatever it was. But I also know Portugal's like on the forefront of all that. It has been for years. Yeah. So, yeah.
We're both in some very relevant places for this work. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah. And so where would you send people to if they wanted to look into your work more?
Oh, well, so I have a book called Awake, It's Your Turn. That's on Amazon. That's probably the primary resource. And the YouTube channel was originally created to just promote the book because I have no other way of promoting it. So I have a YouTube channel called Simply Always Awake. And then if you want to have free guided meditations, there is the app, which is called Simply Awake. And there's 60 some guided meditations on there.
Great. Yeah, I recommend everyone get all those materials.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.